Welcome to What You Don't Know You Don't Know, the podcast that dives headfirst into the surprising, the overlooked, and the misunderstood. Hosted by a curious duo and one man, one woman, we explore the world's most fascinating ideas hiding in plain sight. From science and religion to politics, psychology, history, and everything in between, we shine a light on the knowledge that's publicly available but rarely discussed. Each episode is a deep but never dull conversation that challenges assumptions, sparks new perspectives, and reveals just how much more there is to know, especially about the things you didn't even know you were missing. Whether you're a skeptic, a seeker, or just someone who loves good conversation, this show will leave you thinking, questioning, and most importantly, knowing.
All right, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are plunging into a really fascinating subject, psilocybin mushrooms.
Yeah, definitely a hot topic right now.
Totally. We've got a stack of incredible sources here.
Yeah.
I mean, everything from a talk by a really well-known mycologist to a video looking into microdosing, plus some pretty serious academic research papers.
A good mix.
Our mission, like always, is to take this, mountain of information and boil it down fast so you're properly informed. Get some surprising facts, enough context to really get why this is generating so much buzz.
That's right. And the sources we've got, they give us a really comprehensive look. We're going to explore the deep history, the traditional use,
Right.
then dive into the modern science, both the classic larger doses and this microdosing trend that's popping up everywhere.
Yeah, you hear about that a lot now.
And then look at the potential therapeutic uses. Things being studied for, like mental health conditions, addiction. We'll hit the safety data, too, and think about the bigger picture, the potential impact psilocybin might have, pulling out the key stuff as we go.
It's definitely complex, often misunderstood, and there's just so much information and misinformation floating around.
For sure.
So we're here to help you cut through all that, understand what psilocybin actually is, where it comes from, how scientists are looking at it, what the research is maybe hinting at, potential benefits, and just why does it feel like we're at this kind of turning point right now? Okay, let's unpack this.
Absolutely. And to really get the current moment, you kind of have to go back, way back.
Look.
The knowledge about mushrooms, it stretches back thousands of years, across continents, really. Everywhere except Antarctica, seems like.
Wow.
Indigenous peoples, shamans, they learned about mushrooms through, direct experience. Trial and error, probably a lot of it.
Which ones you can eat, which ones will kill you.
Exactly. Which ones are medicinal, and then which ones had these really profound, mind-altering effects, the quote-unquote magical ones.
And the sources mention something striking about mushrooms themselves. Their nature.
Yeah, how fleeting they are. They just pop up, right? And then they're gone. Poof.
Not like a plant you see all year round.
No. And that ephemeral quality, it made the knowledge about them super precious, but also, really tenuous, easy to lose.
Right, like if a culture was disrupted.
Exactly. Invasions, religious persecution, that knowledge could just vanish, severed.
But bits and pieces survived, didn't they? Echoes.
Yeah, echoes. We see it in those Mesoamerican mushroom stones, some dating way back like 2500 BC.
Incredible.
And there's intriguing Greek stuff, too, imagery like Demeter and Persephone. Speculation that mushroom concoctions were part of the Eleusinian mysteries.
Which philosophers like Socrates and Plato might have taken.
That's the idea, yeah. And even older, cave art from northern Algeria, maybe 7,000 years old, seems to show mushrooms. It suggests they've been significant for a very, very long time.
And how do they preserve them if they rot so fast? Honey.
Honey was one method, yeah. Putting them in honey. And the sources speculate maybe that's even how people discovered the psychoactive effects sometimes, unintended consequence.
Makes sense. But it wasn't all positive reception throughout history.
Oh, definitely not. We see attempts to suppress it, like the Bavarian Beer Act of 1560.
Banning mushrooms in beer.
Yeah. And some speculate that was maybe the Catholic Church trying to stamp out older indigenous Germanic mushroom ceremonies, control the narrative, control the experience.
But then around the same time, you get this completely different story from the New World.
Right. Just as Bavaria is banning them, this Catholic priest, Sahagún, is over in the Americas meticulously recording indigenous use. It's an amazing contrast.
What did he describe?
He wrote about people eating mushrooms with honey, usually before dawn, drinking chocolate, then dancing, singing, leaping.
Wow. Quite the range of expression.
Yeah, or sitting pensively discussing the visions they had. And what's wild is The sources point out that description, it's still pretty much spot on today, shows this incredible continuity of the experience itself across centuries.
So how did this ancient knowledge get sort of rediscovered or brought into wider view
Yeah.
more recently?
Key figures, really. Maria Sabina, the Mazatec shaman in Oaxaca. The sources describe her not just as a shaman, but also a deep mycologist in her own right, understanding the forest fungi.
She shared her knowledge.
She did. And then you have the ethnomycologist, R. Gordon Wasson, and his wife, Valentina Wasson.
Ah, yes, the Wassons.
And the sources really stress Valentina was the scientist, the mycologist, knew the Latin binomials, all that. She's the one who got R. Gordon into wild mushrooms in the first place.
How they keep up with those terms?
Mycophilia, the love of mushrooms,
Yeah.
and mycophobia, the fear. Kind of captures the cultural divide, right?
Totally. And their work led to that big article.
Huge article, Life magazine, right in the middle of the Cold War. Suddenly, millions of people are reading about, identifying, and experiencing these mushrooms. It really opened the floodgates, in a way.
To pave the way for the science part.
Absolutely. Which brings us to Albert Hofmann, already famous for LSD, of course.
Right.
He isolated psilocybin from Psilocybe mexicana in 1957, and then synthesized it, made the first pure synthetic version in 1958.
And that synthetic version is used in a lot of the research now.
A lot of it, yeah. Makes it standardized, quantifiable, but then, things took a...
The Controlled Substances Act, 1970 in the U.S.
Exactly. Big roadblock. Psilocybin, along with other psychedelics, gets slapped with that Schedule I label.
Meaning no accepted medical use, high potential for abuse.
Right. Which basically just slammed the door shut on clinical research for decades. A real shame looking back.
But eventually the door creaked open again.
Yeah, thankfully. Around 1992, a decision by an NIDAF advisory committee cautiously allowed research to start resuming.
And that led to dedicated research groups.
Like the Hefter Research Institute, founded soon after. They've been focused solely on clinical psychedelic research, and psilocybin has been a major focus for them.
Okay, so let's get into the science a bit.
Yeah.
What is psilocybin chemically, and how does it, work in the brain?
Sure. So psilocybin itself is actually a prodrug. Your body converts it into psilocin, which is the active compound. It's found in over 100 mushroom species.
Wow, that many.
Yeah. Chemically, it's a tryptamine, which means it's structurally similar to serotonin, a key neurotransmitter already in our brains, and also similar to other psychedelics like LSD or DMT.
So it hijacks the serotonin system, basically.
Sort of, yeah. It interacts strongly with serotonin receptors. Think of them like docking stations on nerve cells, particularly the 5-HT2A receptor.
Okay.
It binds to that one really well, especially in parts of the brain like the thalamus.
The sensory relay station.
Exactly. And the cortex, the thinking part, the idea is that by activating these 5-HT2A receptors, it might actually decrease activity in the thalamus, less filtering of sensory input.
Which leads to the altered perceptions. Sounds, sights, feelings all mixing up.
That seems to be a key part of it, yeah. Altered sensory gating.
And you mentioned safety earlier. That FDA official quote.
Oh, yeah, that's a striking one from the sources. Reportedly, an FDA official, after reviewing the data, called psilocybin the most potent, least toxic substance they'd ever analyze.
Potent, but not very toxic. That's unusual.
It doesn't mean zero risk, of course, but it does highlight a safety profile that's quite different from many other psychoactive drugs, legal or illegal.
Okay, so knowing a bit about the how, let's talk about the what. What happens with those larger doses? Macrodosing.
Right, macrodosing. Typically defined as, say, a gram or more of dried mushrooms, or maybe 10 milligrams or more of pure psilocybin, enough to cause clear psychoactive effects, sometimes quite profound.
And the studies using these doses, are they showing promise?
Some really remarkable results, yeah. That Johns Hopkins study is a standout. They used synthesized psilocybin and found these large, rapid, really fast and importantly, enduring decreases in depression and anxiety after just a single session.
A single session. That's hard to believe almost.
It really challenges the standard model, doesn't it? The idea that one or maybe two guided experiences could lead to such a significant lasting shift instead of needing daily medication for years.
Definitely. And what about for depression that hasn't responded to other treatments?
Yeah, treatment-resistant depression. There are studies comparing psilocybin directly to standard antidepressants like acetalopram, a common SSRI. Findings suggest potentially similar effectiveness in reducing depression symptoms. But crucially, maybe with fewer of those common, often bothersome SSRI side effects.
Like,
Things like anxiety, dry mouth, sexual dysfunction, that feeling of emotional blunting some people get. The psilocybin groups didn't report those as much.
interesting. Any other areas for macrodosing?
Early work, like a pilot study looking at anxiety in patients with advanced stage cancer.
That must be intense anxiety.
Exactly. And they found a single high dose significantly decreased anxiety and improved mood compared to a placebo niacin in that case. And the effects lasted for months. For people facing end-of-life issues, that could be incredibly valuable.
But these high-dose studies face a challenge, right? The placebo problem.
Big challenge. It's really hard to do a true double-blind study when the effects are so obvious.
Yeah, you probably know if you got the real deal or the sugar pill.
Pretty much.
Why?
So people know which group they're in, and that expectation can definitely influence the results. Researchers are trying creative ways around it, but it's a known limitation.
Okay, so that's the big dose picture. What about the other end of the scale? Microdosing.
Right. The opposite approach. Taking tiny doses, subintoxicating, non-perceptual.
Meaning you don't feel high, you don't trip.
Exactly. The idea is maybe 1/10, even 1/20th of a macrodose. We're talking maybe 1 to 3 milligrams of pure psilocybin or just a fraction of a gram of dried mushrooms. The goal isn't the psychedelic experience. It's more subtle shifts in mood, focus, creativity maybe.
And Dr. James Fadiman is a key name here.
Yeah, often called the father of microdosing. Because of the legal situation for so long, he couldn't easily run clinical trials, so he gathered data mostly through self-report surveys, people trying it on their own and telling him what happened.
So based on that early self-reported data, what did people say they experienced?
Oh, really wide range of stuff, actually. Reduced anxiety was a big one. General anxiety, social anxiety, even specific things like test anxiety.
Okay.
Reduced depression symptoms. Some reported help with conditions like Asperger's. And get this significant reduction in ice pick headaches, like 80–90% reduction for some people.
Wow, that's specific. What else beyond mood?
People reported getting more insights, personal stuff, or work-related problems.
Yeah.
Improved learning languages, math, better focus, better grades. Alleviation of PMS symptoms, both physical and emotional. Less triggering for past trauma. Less procrastination. That's one I hear a lot anecdotally, too.
The procrastination killer.
Hey.
Sign me up.
Huh. Yeah. And even reports of better sex, libido, feeling closer to partners, improved work performance, getting into that flow state more easily, better quality work. And some people reported it helped them taper off psychiatric meds they felt weren't working or had too many side effects.
That's a massive list of potential benefits from tiny doses. The key insight seems to be the sheer diversity of effects people were reporting.
Exactly. Mental, emotional, cognitive, even physical stuff like PMS or headaches. It's really broad.
How might these tiny doses even work? What are the theories?
Well, several ideas get thrown around in the sources.
Well,
One is, yeah, maybe it's partly a strong placebo effect. The mind-body connection is powerful.
sure.
Or maybe it's more like a systemic effect, like taking a vitamin, something that just helps overall functioning over time subtly.
Like tuning up the system.
Kind of. Or maybe there are effects on mitochondria, the energy factories in our cells. And importantly, maybe it still taps into increasing neuroplasticity, that brain flexibility, just at a lower level than macro doses.
Brain's ability to change and adapt.
Right, which could underpin a lot of those reported benefits.
And you mentioned unintended improvements.
Yeah, this was interesting. People started microdosing for, say, anxiety, but then found themselves like eating healthier without trying, or starting to exercise more, or cutting back on other substances, not just hard drugs, but even things like alcohol or caffeine, just a general shift towards healthier habits for some.
Interesting knock-on effects.
Yeah.
Now, moving beyond those early surveys, there's this app, Quantified Citizen.
Right, microdose.me. This is trying to collect data on a much bigger scale, systematically,
How big?
over 22,000 participants, last I checked in the sources. It's anonymous, ethics reviewed, and it's not just asking how do you feel. It includes validated psychiatric tests, like happing tests, measuring psychomotor speed and coordination, alongside self-reports on mood, anxiety, depression. And it tracks if people are combining microdosing with other things.
Stacking, like with niacin or lion's mane.
Exactly. We'll get to the stack in a sec.
Okay, so what has this big data set shown so far? Studies published from it.
Papers in Nature Scientific Reports. Using this data, they confirm the main reasons people microdose. Trying to reduce anxiety and depression, or boost performance and cognition.
Matches the anecdotes.
It does. And crucially, the data did show reported improvements in mood and reductions in both anxiety and depression scores over time. So this large-scale data starts to add more weight to those earlier, more anecdotal reports.
But there's still pushback, right? Skepticism. Some trials haven't found effects.
Absolutely. And the sources mention this. There have been studies, often using mostly healthy volunteers, that didn't find a significant difference between microdosing and placebo.
Why might that be?
Well, one perspective, voiced by Fadiman and others, is that maybe you need to have symptoms to measure improvement effectively. If you're already feeling pretty good, not anxious or depressed.
It's hard to measure getting better.
Exactly. The signal might be too small to detect against the noise in a healthy population. Whereas if you start with moderate depression, there's more room to see a change. Makes sense, intuitively.
It does. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. This concept of the stack.
Yeah, the Stamets stack, popularized by mycologist Paul Stamets.
It's not just psilocybin.
No, it's a combination. Microdosing psilocybin mushrooms plus lion's mane mushroom.
Which has its own brain health reputation.
Right. Contains compounds like arenosines, thought to stimulate nerve growth factors, help remyelination, basically nerve repair and growth.
Okay. And the third ingredient?
Niacin. Vitamin B3.
Why niacin?
The theory is twofold. One, niacin causes vasodilation, that flushing effect. It might help deliver the other compounds across the blood-brain barrier more effectively. And two, maybe it acts as some kind of catalyst, enhancing the overall effect.
A delivery system and a booster.
That's the hypothesis.
And the data from Quantified Citizen on this specific stack, particularly that TAP test.
Yeah, this is pretty astonishing, as presented in the sources. They looked specifically at participants over 55 using the Stamets stack.
Okay.
And they found a statistically significant increase in their tapping speed and ability over just 30 days. Went from averaging like 48 taps to 68 taps.
Wow. That's a big jump in a month.
It really is. And the key insight here, the sources stress, is that tapping speed isn't just subjective, I feel better. It's an objective measure of psychomotor performance, coordination, speed.
Things that tend to decline with age.
Exactly. So the potential significance for things like reducing fall risk in older adults, preserving fine motor skills, cognitive speed, it's seen as incredibly exciting, a potential performance enhancer for aging brains and bodies.
So what's the proposed science behind why this combination might work so much better, the synergy?
They're looking at specific biological pathways in the brain. Think communication networks involving proteins like MAP kinases and receptors linked to stimulating nerve growth factors.
Like BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
Exactly, BDNF, like fertilizer for brain cells. And the preclinical lab tests described are fascinating. They tested the individual components, psilocybin, psilocin, the arenosines from lion's mane.
And they had some effect alone.
Some activity, yeah. But the kicker, according to the sources, was when they put them together in the stack combination. They saw the synergistic effect.
Meaning?
Reportedly 4 to 6 times more activity at stimulating these key receptors, even at the low microdosing concentrations. Much greater than the sum of the parts.
That's where the gunpowder analogy comes in.
That's the one. Charcoal, sulfur, potassium nitrate alone, not much happens. Mix them together. Boom.
Right.
Similarly, these natural compounds in the stack seem to have this explosive synergistic effect on these neural pathways related to nerve growth and potentially antidepressant effects too.
And this synergy, it might even be patentable.
That's the suggestion. If this specific combination of natural products doesn't occur together in nature, the synergistic effect could potentially be patented, which has obvious commercial implications.
And it's not just the main players. Psilocybin and arenosines.
There's also talk of an entourage effect, the idea that it's not just psilocybin itself, but maybe other related compounds naturally present in the mushrooms, other non-psychedelic tryptamines produced alongside psilocybin might also contribute to the overall effect, working together synergistically across the whole system.
Okay, so fascinating mechanism, incredible observational data from the TAP test, but caution is needed.
Big caution flag waved in the sources. This is still pre-clinical lab work and observational data from an app. It's not the same as rigorous, controlled clinical trials in humans.
Needs that clinical proof.
Absolutely. The potential is huge, exciting, but the scientific process demands that next level of evidence.
Gotcha. Okay, speaking of potential therapies, the sources also talk quite a bit about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, the Choi et al. Paper really digs into this, exploring psilocybin as a potential treatment, especially for people who, haven't been helped by current treatments or maybe can't access them or tolerate the side effects.
What's generally understood about what's going wrong in the brain with PTSD?
Well, you see changes in key brain areas involved in fear, memory, and regulation. The amygdala, the fear center, tends to be hyperactive.
Overreacting.
Right. The hippocampus, involved in memory, might be smaller. And the prefrontal cortex, which helps regulate emotions and makes decisions, often shows decreased activity and connectivity. Plus, changes in neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine.
And the current go-to treatments.
Trauma-focused psychotherapy like EMDR or prolonged exposure is considered most effective. But it's intense, not always available, not everyone responds.
Right.
Other therapies are less effective. Meditation is showing some promise, interestingly, maybe synergistic with other approaches. And then you have medications.
SSRIs here.
Yeah, SSRIs and SNRIs are first-line pharmacotherapy. But often the benefits are only partial, or the side effects, weight gain, sexual issues, emotional flattening, make people stop taking them. There's a big unmet need.
So how might psilocybin fit in? What could it do differently for PTSD?
Several proposed mechanisms, both biological and psychological. Pharmacologically, it acts on some of those same brain circuits affected by PTSD. It seems to potentially reduce the amygdala's reactivity to negative stuff, but maybe increase responsiveness to positive stuff.
Rebalancing the emotional response.
Possibly. And that 5-HT2A receptor action, same target as SSRIs, but psilocybin hits it differently. This is linked to things like enhanced fear extinction, helping the brain unlearn conditioned fear responses, and boosting positive mood. It also seems to modulate dopamine pathways, which are also implicated in PTSD.
And the neuroplasticity again.
Yeah.
Making the brain more adaptable.
Crucial aspect, yeah. Promoting neuroplasticity could physically help the brain rewire those fear circuits, grow new connections, facilitate that fear extinction process.
And psychologically, within therapy.
This is key. Psychedelic-assisted therapy isn't just about the drug. It's the drug within a therapeutic container preparation, the session with therapists present, and then integration sessions afterwards to make sense of it all.
Right, set and setting.
Exactly. The idea is the psilocybin experience can help loosen rigid defenses, allow difficult emotional material related to the trauma to surface and be processed.
Safely.
In a supported way, yeah. Increase insight into the trauma's impact, help people weave the experience into their life story in a less destructive way.
There was also that model mentioned, REB-S.
Yeah, relaxed beliefs under psychedelics and anarchic brain. It's a framework suggesting psychedelics temporarily relax the brain's usual top-down control systems.
The inner critic quiets down.
Sort of. Those systems often maintain the rigid negative beliefs common in PTSD, the stuck points. By relaxing those constraints, psilocybin might allow the brain to become more flexible and more open to new information and perspectives, making it easier to revise those pathological beliefs about the trauma and oneself.
Now, a lot of the recent buzz around psychedelics and PTSD has been about MDMA, right?
True, the MDMA-assisted therapy trials for PTSD have shown really impressive results, significant symptom reduction. That's definitely further along in the research pipeline.
But psilocybin is being looked at specifically for PTSD too.
Yes, the sources make that clear. While maybe not as advanced as MDMA yet, psilocybin research for PTSD is definitely emerging and growing. There was an early small trial in AIDS survivors with trauma that showed promise despite limitations.
And more studies are happening now.
Critically, yes. The sources mention several studies are currently underway, listed on clinicaltrials.gov, including trials specifically for veterans and for treatment-resistant PTSD, investigating psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, PAP.
So watch this space.
Definitely. It's a really active area of research driven by that urgent need for better PTSD treatments.
Okay, with all these powerful effects, we have to talk seriously about safety. What does the bigger picture look like from the research?
While looking at meta-analyses, pooling data from multiple studies, and also large population surveys, the safety profile for low to moderate doses, especially in controlled settings, looks surprisingly good, according to the sources.
Like that pooled analysis.
Yeah, Studeris et al. They pooled data from studies with healthy volunteers, hundreds of administrations. found low to moderate doses were generally well tolerated.
Any issues?
Few adverse reactions, mostly mild, resolved quickly, mainly happened at the very highest doses tested. And importantly, follow-up, sometimes over a year later, showed no signs of increased drug abuse, no persistent perception disorders like HPPD, no long-term psychosis issues, no lasting cognitive problems.
That's reassuring. What about in the wild, so to speak? General population use?
There was that big U.S. population study, Johansson and Krebs, looked at nearly 20,000 psychedelic users, found no significant link between lifetime use of classic psychedelics, including psilocybin, and increased rates of mental health treatment needed, or suicidal thoughts or attempts.
No link to increased problems.
Right. And interestingly, some of their data even hinted the opposite, that the group who only used psilocybin might have actually fared slightly better on measures of psychological distress and suicidality compared to people who used no psychedelics or who used other ones.
Huh. That's counterintuitive to the old narratives.
It really is. And a review from the Netherlands came to similar conclusions. Low dependence potential, moderate acute toxicity risk, but severe reactions are rare, low chronic toxicity risk, negligible public health risks overall.
But it's not risk-free, right? There are potential adverse effects.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's crucial to state that transient but significant fear or paranoia can happen, especially reported in one study using very high doses. That's a real psychological risk.
Okay. Physical effects.
Mild increases in heart rate and blood pressure are pretty consistently seen across studies, usually not dangerous for healthy people, but something to monitor. Headaches afterwards are also reported fairly often.
And difficult experiences. Bad trips.
Yes, dysphoric subjective effects, basically having a really unpleasant, difficult time, can occur. And one specific mushroom, psilocybe azurescens, which is known to be very potent, is specifically noted in the sources as sometimes causing temporary paralysis or loss of muscle control, which sounds pretty scary.
Yeah. Is there a way around that?
Apparently, preparing it with hot water seems to alleviate that specific issue, but it highlights that different species might have slightly different effect profiles or risks.
Good to know. And what about actual lethal toxicity?
The sources put this in perspective. The LD50, the dose that would be lethal to 50% of test animals, usually rats, is incredibly high, equivalent to a human eating something like 17 kilograms, that's like 37 pounds, of fresh mushrooms.
Basically physically impossible.
Pretty much. And over decades of known use, very few deaths have been directly attributed solely to psilocybin toxicity. The risk profile is just vastly different from substances like opioids or even alcohol in terms of acute lethal overdose.
Still, that positive safety data mostly comes from studies, right? Controlled settings.
Critical caveat, yes. Results from carefully screened participants in supportive clinical settings might not perfectly translate to unsupervised recreational use, especially for people with underlying mental health vulnerabilities or who mix substances. Context matters hugely.
Absolutely. Okay, so beyond PTSD and depression anxiety, what about addiction? Is psilocybin being studied there?
Yes, and some really interesting findings are emerging. For alcohol dependence, there was a small, early proof-of-concept study. Just 10 patients, but it showed a significant drop in drinking days after psilocybin sessions.
Promising start. Tobacco.
A pilot study for smoking cessation combined psilocybin sessions with cognitive behavioral therapy. The results were quite striking. 80% of participants were confirmed abstinent from smoking at a 6-month follow-up.
80%. That's huge for smoking cessation.
It's exceptionally high, yeah. Needs larger trials to confirm, but very promising.
And then there were those broader studies linking psilocybin use to crime reduction. That sounds almost unbelievable.
It does, but the sources highlight these meta-studies looking at huge populations, including hundreds of thousands of people within the justice system.
What did they find?
Consistently, psilocybin was the only classic psychedelic statistically associated with significant reductions in various types of property crime, like theft and burglary, but also violent crime. Wow.
And also associated with reductions in intimate partner violence and reductions in opioid use disorder diagnoses.
That's profound. The potential societal impact of that is enormous.
It really is. The key insight isn't just treating an individual's addiction, but a potential link to reduced harm and violence in the community more broadly.
Yeah.
It's a major finding, if it holds up.
Definitely. Okay, quickly, what about OCD? Obsessive-compulsive disorder.
A bit less research here, but some hints. There's a case report from 2014, one person with really treatment-resistant OCD who found relief after taking mushrooms, lasting about 3 weeks per dose. Low evidence level, just one person, but suggestive.
Okay.
And a small study by Moreno et al. With 9 patients, also treatment-resistant, showed dose-dependent reduction in OCD symptoms for hours right after taking psilocybin. Safety seemed okay, just mild BPHR changes, so another area that probably warrants more investigation.
Any other conditions mentioned?
Autism gets a mention in the sources, but framed as controversial and definitely needing proper clinical proof, not something to experiment with lightly.
And then those correlations reducing procrastination, which we joked about.
Still interested.
And increasing nature-relatedness, that feeling of connection to the natural world. One meta-study apparently found psilocybin was the only psychedelic significantly linked to boosting that, statistically speaking.
Interesting connection. Okay, let's zoom out again.
Yeah.
Connect these dots to the bigger picture, the broader impact, the vision discussed in the sources.
Right. Because if these therapeutic effects are real, reducing addiction, violence, crime, trauma, the sources argue it's not just about fixing one person.
It ripples outwards.
Exactly. Healing an individual can benefit their partner, their kids, their family, their neighbors, the whole community. You potentially replace cycles of harm with waves of positive change.
And there were anecdotes suggesting this is already influencing thinking, like law enforcement.
Yeah, stories of police officers potentially changing their approach, maybe making fewer arrests for simple possession, recognizing the potential for harm reduction rather than just punishment. And military veterans, SEALs, seeking out this kind of therapy for deep-seated trauma. It's crossing traditional boundaries.
Which ties into the legal shifts we're seeing.
Absolutely. Over 22 U.S. states, mentioned in the sources, having bills or ballot initiatives moving forward. Colorado and Oregon actually passing laws to decriminalize or set up regulated therapeutic access.
And the ballot initiatives are seen as particularly powerful.
Yeah, described as almost a people's revolution. It gives politicians cover, basically. The public voted for it, so now we enact it, take some of the political risk off the table for them.
And Canada's doing work, too.
Mentioned as leading in some ways, yeah. Government-approved group therapy trials for end-of-life patients dealing with that existential dread. Work pioneered by people like Dr. Pam Crisco. It shows a willingness to explore compassionate use.
Paul Stamets, the mycologist, he has a particularly grand vision for this, doesn't he?
He really does. He talks about psilocybin potentially fostering a fundamental paradigm shift in consciousness.
Yeah.
Leading to greater unity, a recognition of how interconnected everything is, not just humans, but all organisms, all matter. He calls it potentially a gateway into universal consciousness.
That's big thinking.
It is. He frames this moment as our time, a time to lead with good science, to welcome skeptics, to reach across political divides. He specifically mentions veterans helping bridge that gap and to move forward responsibly, but also with kindness for people who might misuse or misunderstand these substances.
And he shared that one-word insight from an experience.
Existence. Just. Existence. Simple but profound, speaks to that potential for a fundamental shift in perspective, that deep connection some people report.
Wow. Okay, before we wrap up, the sources did touch on some practical mushroom stuff.
Yeah.
Identifying them, growing them.
Yeah, a little bit on the mycology. I mentioned key psilocybe species like P. cubensis, that's the most common one, easiest to cultivate, found worldwide.
Okay.
P. azurescens, very potent, grows on wood chips, often in the Pacific Northwest, has that distinct wavy stem, bruises really blue. But that's the one linked to that temporary paralysis issue if not prepared right.
Good to know. Others.
P. cyanescens, also wavy cap, wood chips. P. semilanceata, the classic liberty cap, grows in grassy areas, often near water. Distinct pointy cap, thin stem, doesn't always bruise blue.
Key ID features to look for, generally.
Dark spores are key purple-brown to black spore prints for most psilocybe, and that characteristic bluish bruising when handled or damaged. Though not all psychoactive species bruise blue, and some non-psychoactive ones do, so it's not foolproof.
And warnings about lookalikes.
Huge GE warning, especially about deadly Galerina species like Galerina marginata. They can look similar and sometimes grow right alongside psilocybe species. But Galerina have rusty brown spores, not dark purple-black. Mix them up and it's fatal. Cannot stress enough, accurate identification is critical. If in doubt, throw it out.
Absolutely crucial. And growing conditions.
Varies by species. Wood chips for some, dung for cubensis, grass for others, often triggered by environmental changes. Rain, temperature drops, light, oxygen.
And the mycelium network underground.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Described as this internet-like network. Learning membranes at the growing tips that sense toxins or food send info back through the network. Compared metaphorically to the internet, our nervous system, even the large-scale structure of the universe.
Wild. Where did the wood-loving ones even come from?
Speculation in the sources may be spread by animals like beavers, woodpeckers, squirrels, voles disturbing wood. Or maybe they live inside trees as endophytes and get stimulated when the wood is chipped up for mulch. Still some mystery there.
And quickly, popular ways people take them. Chocolates.
Yeah, making chocolates is common where it's legal. Easy to dose, masks the taste. But cautions mentioned, dosage can be uneven in homemade chocolates, risk of kids or guests finding them accidentally. Some people apparently label them cleverly as laxatives as a deterrent. But again, only do this where it's legal and be extremely careful about storage and access.
Right. Safety first, legality first. Okay, so pulling this all together, what are the main challenges looking forward? What's the future hold?
Biggest challenge, reiterated throughout the sources, the need for more rigorous clinical trials. That high-quality clinical proof to confirm the benefits seen in early studies and observational data and to understand the risks better.
And the legal hurdles.
Still significant. That federal Schedule I status in the U.S. is a major barrier to research and access, even as states change their laws. Creates a messy legal landscape. Strong calls from advocates to reschedule psychedelics based on the emerging evidence.
And responsible use is key.
Absolutely paramount. Need for proper guardrails, especially with macrodosing. That means trained therapists, safe settings, good screening. The sources talk about the therapist's role as holding space, while nature, or the mushroom, provides the experience.
And trials comparing different approaches, like the STAT.
Yeah, essential next steps. Clinical trials directly comparing, say, the Stamets stack versus psilocybin alone versus placebo. Or maybe open label for macrodosing given the blinding issues, but microdosing is probably well suited for good placebo control. We need that comparative data.
And finally, that sense of preserving knowledge.
Yeah, a poignant point about the sacred duty to learn from and preserve the traditional indigenous knowledge, especially from elders, before it's lost. Recognizing the value in both ancient wisdom and modern science.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a ton of ground here.
We really have.
From, ancient ceremonies thousands of years ago, through historical suppression, the rediscovery by science, the nitty-gritty of how it works in the brain, all the way to modern research on macrodosing, microdosing, that wild Stamets stack concept, potential treatments of PTSD, depression, addiction.
Our crime reduction links.
Right. The surprising crime reduction links, the safety profile discussions, and those really big philosophical ideas about consciousness and connection.
Yeah, I mean, the key takeaways really are. Psilocybin has this incredibly long history of human use. Modern research is showing genuine promise, sometimes remarkable promise, for tough mental health conditions, addiction, maybe even boosting cognitive and psychomotor function, especially with things like the stack.
Yeah.
But the safety data from studies looks generally favorable at the doses studied, but it's not risk-free. And critically, more rigorous, large-scale clinical research is absolutely essential to confirm all this potential and figure out how to use it safely and effectively. We're not quite there yet.
So, for you listening,
Yeah.
Why should you care about all this? I mean, this information, it really challenges a lot of conventional ideas about certain substances, right?
Totally.
It opens up potential new ways to treat things that we've struggled with for a long time. And it touches on these really deep ideas about our minds, our connection to each other, to nature. It's evolving so fast, and it has real-world implications for healthcare, for society, maybe even for how we see ourselves.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with, something that really stood out from the sources. If, and it's still an if needing more proof, but if psilocybin, used responsibly, truly helps people become, as some suggest, nicer, less violent, more connected, less prone to addiction, less burdened by trauma,
Yeah.
how might its wider integration into society, done carefully, actually change things? Our approach to mental health care? Sure, but maybe even community relations, crime, our relationship with the environment. What stands out to you from everything we've unpacked today? Lots to think about.
And that's a wrap on this episode of What You Don't Know, You Don't Know. If your brain feels a little fuller or like it just stumbled onto something way more interesting than expected, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss next week's deep dive into, well, something you didn't even know you didn't know.